to the channel, everybody. In this video, I'm just going to kind of talk about why I think NASCAR has lost some of its old school fans. And yeah, I don't know if they'll ever come back or not, but in this video, I'm going to talk about why. So as I said, this video is pretty much just going to be me talking, which I can do pretty well. So there was a big boom in the 90s. And this is one of the first things that I think ruins everything, and that's big money. Once big money gets involved, it's just, the whole thing goes to crap. So I think with that big money, obviously it drew in a lot of, people that wanted to get their claws into it and wanted to get their fangs into it. Just like anything else, whenever something comes popular, you have a bunch of people that want to exploit it. So you had all these big corporations, big businessmen getting in there. And one of the things that they did is you had a couple businessmen, they bought up some tracks that were historical and, meant a lot to the sport. And they closed them down to build these cookie cutter tracks that kind of all look the same. Now, I'm not going to say they do look the same, but I'll put some screenshots up here on the screen for you. And it kind of seemed like you were watching the same race day in and day out. Like, I'm glad that they built the speedway in Kansas because it gave me a closer opportunity to go to NASCAR races. But honestly, it's like watching the same race. And then it led into, well, NASCAR doesn't even give a crap about its roots anymore because they're, getting rid of all these. I mean, how are you going to get rid of North Wilkesboro? And I remember when there were talks about Martinsville, there was a couple tracks that were iconic that were kind of, it's like, man, I hope they stay around. Now, thankfully, Martinsville did, and if anybody has ever wanted to go to a race at Martinsville, I highly suggest it. It's like stepping back in time and going to just what NASCAR, started out as. You close down tracks like North Wilkesboro, Rockingham, taking away races from some of these tracks to give to these newer tracks, which, like I said, they weren't that exciting. What brought people in was the bumping and banging and the grinding of these short track guys just absolutely fighting for positions and giving it everything they've got to cross the finish line first. I mean, there's plenty of great footage out there. Dale Earnhardt and Terry Labonte and Bill Elliott and some of these guys just battling it out. Kenny Schrader and Rusty Wallace. I mean, there's some great footage from back in the 80s and 90s of these guys just going around these short tracks and absolutely drawing you in with that type of racing. And that's what drew people in. Like, dude, you got to check this out, man. This is awesome. Me personally, I love Rockingham. And I still enjoy, places like Dover. I enjoy places like Pocono that have a kind of distinctness to them. There's no other track like them. And so that's kind of where, your interest was like, okay. And let me let me back up and just say it's not one thing. It was a bunch. It was like a snowball effect, a bunch of different things. And so you can go all the way back to restrictor plates. I remember when a lot of people were complaining that they were putting restrictor plates on the cars on the super speedways because that's not what racing was. But then they started messing with the format. So they started the chase, which in itself wasn't a horrible idea, but where it got crazy was the first few years, like you couldn't keep track of like who was going to make it, you know, what the criteria was to make it in. They kept changing it to the point where I know and this is just me, I was just like, I don't even know, you know, how you get into the chase anymore. They changed it from the chase to the playoffs, which I think is dumb, but, you know, whatever. And then when they made it to where you only have to win one race to get into the playoffs, and then you can pretty much sandbag the rest of the year and not have to do anything, it was frustrating as a old school purist NASCAR fan. Then, you know, once they started changing that, you had NASCAR talking about breaking the race up into stages. Now, I know the great Carl Edwards talked about this, and he was against it. And I was against it too. And I actually didn't realize, I'd been out of NASCAR for a few years when they finally made this decision. I had taken a group of guys to a NASCAR race in Richmond. And we're sitting there and I'm explaining everything, you know, about what's going to go on and yada, yada, yada. Well, then a caution come out and they're like, you know, what's going on? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I don't see a wreck. I mean, maybe there's debris on the field. They can throw the yellow for debris. And I'm looking, and all of a sudden I look up the scoreboard. Everybody's pitting, and it said end of stage 1. I'm like, what the hell is this? Stage 1? And then I found out that NASCAR had broken up the races into stages. They went to stage racing. It's like, what is that? You know, You're freaking taking a non-traditional sport and you're trying to make it fit into a slot of a regular stick and ball traditional sport. You're trying to fit a freaking round peg into a square hole or a square peg into a round hole. Either one, it doesn't make sense. What are you doing? Now, you don't have to worry about fuel strategy. You know you're going to automatically get pits at, you know, certain points in the race. So, yeah, you might have to manage tires a little bit, but not as much as you used to. Same with fuel strategy. I remember back in the old setup, I watched people freaking run out of gas on their victory lap because they managed the fuel that well. I mean, could you imagine that? Crossing the finish line first, praying that you're going to freaking have enough fuel, and then you end up running out of fuel on your way back. I seen somebody, I don't know how many people I've seen run out of fuel on turn 4, coming towards the checkered flag. And I know they have to be praying that they got enough momentum to get by, and they didn't. They got passed right at the last minute. So I've also seen people, you know, that freaking, they run out of gas during the burnout. So that's what made the fuel strategy so important. Now you don't even have to worry about that, really. You know, you're not going, like, you'll never have a fast race. And I can't remember if it's Rusty Wallace or not. I can't remember who it was, but they won the fastest NASCAR race ever because it went from green to checkered without any cautions. You're never going to have that anymore. And I mean, in a race like that, you have got to strategize, you know, your pit strategy. So then that just put a bad taste in my mouth. So then they went to overtime. Now, used to, NASCAR could finish on a yellow. I can't remember when they changed it, but everybody was so glad that they changed it. Because now, if a caution was thrown, even if it was the last lap, they had to do a green-white checkered. And for so long, even at your local tracks, it's called a green-white checkered. Now they're calling it overtime. It's like, again, what are you doing? It's not a traditional sport. Just stop with this crap. You know? You got stages, you got playoffs, you got overtime. I mean, stop changing the damn sport for the love of, just stop. So now you have taken people like myself, other hardcore fans that watched it from the 80s, 90s growing on up, that brought their friends in. It's so unrecognizable that I don't care for it anymore. And I know that I don't have to watch it. Now, I still watch certain events. I'll go to certain events live. I'll go to certain races live. But if I'm not that into it, because it's not what I fell in love with, well, that means probably, most likely, the person that I brought along that fell in love with it as well, if I can't recognize it, they can't recognize it. If I don't like it anymore, then they don't like it anymore. And that's how you lost most of your fans. Now, there's one more aspect into this, and I'll get into that. Well, I guess there's two more aspects, but they both deal with drivers. So the first one is, everybody cannot stand when NASCAR wants to pick and choose who they're going to follow the rules for and who they're not. Now, I'm a huge Carl Edwards fan. I watched him on dirt here in Missouri, and I've watched him on NASCAR, both on TV and in person. And there's been times where I think that, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I think that he was screwed over. And he's not the only driver. I think there's a bunch of times when NASCAR needs to figure out what the hell they're doing. Now, like I said, I'm just a fan. I'm a nobody. But as a fan, it gets infuriating when you penalize my guy this week, and then somebody else does the very same thing a week, maybe 2 weeks later, and you just let it slide by. You got umpteen people up there in the booth watching for this stuff. You can't tell me that you missed that, So, I mean, come on. That gets infuriating to fans, and they're like, dude, what are you doing here? Now, that is on my first part on the drivers about, sometimes it feels like NASCAR is inconsistent with who gets a pass and who doesn't. Okay, so let's go to the next point. I remember watching Kenny Wallace's video, and one of his takes was that some of the old drivers had retired. Now, and their fans kind of left because the days of Dale and Bill Elliott and, Kenny Schrader and Terry Labonte and Alice and all them guys are gone. And yeah, to a certain extent, I see that, but I don't agree with it 100%, because here's why. I'm a big Kansas City Chiefs fan. Now, hate on me if you want to. I don't care. They were a crap team for a long time. Now it's our time. But I digress. I didn't stop watching football when Joe Montana retired. I didn't stop watching football when the Chiefs traded Rich Gannon to the Raiders. Rich Gannon was one of my favorite quarterbacks, as you can tell. I digress. But anyway, you don't stop. I didn't stop watching when Dale Earnhardt passed. I didn't stop watching, when I kind of got out of it when Carl Edwards, announced his retirement. But I didn't stop watching fully, because then I switched over to Martin Truex Jr., So I don't think it's because all those old school drivers retired. It's all the reasons I just mentioned. You had big money coming in, changing the tracks, changing the layout, NASCAR changing the format of the race, adding all these things in, trying to make it like a stick and ball sport, a traditional sport, when it's been not a traditional sport since it started. And then you have the drivers. NASCAR wants to pick and choose and play favoritism. But then you have the drivers of today. The drivers of back in the day, you know, like Dale Earnhardt and like some of them other guys, they didn't start out as born and bred race car drivers. Now, let me preface this, that this is not any of the drivers nowadays. It's not any of their fault. I'm just telling you the thoughts from an average fan. Back in the day, you had people that worked, that raced on the side, and they had some natural talent, and that they got rides in there, and they were, you know, all the stars aligned, and they, you know, hit it off and made history. Now, some of them, obviously, like Richard Petty, he followed in his dad Lee Petty's footsteps. And, you know, they had the business established by then. But even Dale Earnhardt had to work a job before he got his big break. You know, a lot of those drivers did. They were rough and tumble kind of drivers. You know, they didn't mind battling it out there on the racetrack and then go working on the farm. Now you have these Nancy prima donnas that are put into a race car at 6 years old, 5 years old, whatever, little go-kart or whatever, and they've been racing ever since they were 6. They're in the top tier series at 22, you know, 21. And then they want to get out there and wreck somebody this week, but somebody nudges them next week, and oh man, they've got their panties so much in a knot that it's ridiculous. And it's like, dude, why are you whining? I know it's points and stuff, but it's, and from outside, that's all it looks like, is a bunch of prima donnas up there crying and whining because somebody rubbed them aggressively, and they did the very same thing last week. So it's like you can dish it out, but you can't take it. Then you're going to get up here and cry and whine instead of just keeping your trap shut and doing what you need to do on a racetrack. Dale and them, they knew what was going on. Yeah, you might get me this week. I'm not going to say too much about it. They might let it known that they were unhappy, you know, during an interview or whatever. But, you know, they knew that time would come around, you know. So that was just the attitude. And I mean, now it's just, you get tired of hearing it. Not only that, but anytime you go to an event, they kind of keep their drivers separate. And they're like I said, they're prima donnas. You got to stick stuff through the fence to have them sign it, and they stay in their trailers. And you know, I kind of get that to a certain extent, you know. But that's why I like the NHRA and stuff like the National Tractor Pulling Association, is because, you know, you can get. Even the NHRA, you can get right up there, get autographs, talk with the drivers, you know, do pretty cool stuff like that. But the point is most of your old school fans, you can't relate to these new drivers. You can't relate. Back in the day when, you know, you had somebody like Dale Earnhardt that worked in a factory for a little while before he made it big, or, you know, so-and-so worked a job, and again, it just happened more often back then. They weren't born and bred race car drivers, because most of us, unless you're born to a well-off family, you know, you're not racing. Not at 7, 8 years old. You know, hell, not even at 16 years old. So, I mean, that's the case. You know, that's the thing. I think all those things combined kind of lost you your old school fans. Now, like I said, I'm not trying to harp on the drivers today, because that goes back to, like I said, that goes back to big money. Anytime you got big money involved where you can make a career out of something, parents are going to kind of, if their kid wants to do it and they've got the money, then they're going to let their kids do it to try to make a living out of it when they get older. I don't fault them. I've already told, you know, my significant other, if my little boy wants to race, you know, I was going to race. But that's my honest opinion about it. You know, so I believe that's why, I know that's, all those are why myself and several other old school fans that I've talked to had just kind of lost interest in NASCAR. Now, that being said, them doing stuff like, even though it didn't work out like they wanted it to, bringing the dirt race to Bristol, that was a change, like moving back in the old direction. You know, they hadn't been on dirt. The top series hadn't been on dirt since 1971. That was awesome, you know? And the fact that they moved the All-Star race from Texas to North Wilkesboro, I'll tell you, I couldn't be happier. Now, I've missed it. I missed it last year, but I am hoping that my work schedule, now all the stars align and I can get out there, because that's what I'm talking about. You know, that's NASCAR trying to go back to its roots, to go back to its fan base, and that's what I like to see. You know, NASCAR has strayed away from the traditions that it started out with. And, you know, making small steps like that, I was hearing that the Clash may be in Bowman Gray Stadium. So that will be awesome. If you've never heard of Bowman Gray Stadium, you should look it up, because it is a freaking awesome venue. And if you ever take a trip out east, I would highly recommend going there. So with that being said, that's my 2 cents on it. If you want to dive into NASCAR, like I said, Slap Shoes has a really great YouTube channel. There's also this great series called NASCAR, The Golden Era, and it has some wonderful stories, interviews from some old drivers, like we're talking back in the 50s, you know, and 60s. So that's a really cool series. And look up some of the tracks, and if there's a schedule, look up the schedule, and if they're at a track near you, even though things have changed, I highly recommend getting a ticket, going to see a NASCAR race in person, because it is one heck of an experience. And like I always say, be safe, be courteous. It's the experience that matters, so go make it a good one.